I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to notice, one, how useful would it be to know the answer to that question? Number two, has anyone ever asked you that question before? And number three, can you answer the question? Number one, what is the most effective path to building a sustainable, a useful new friendship in your city? Where would you go, and what would you do to have the best odds of forming a good friendship in your city? In the event of becoming a multiplanetary species, of having a base on the moon, perhaps a base on Mars, what is the single biggest psychological risk, be it jealousy, be it suicidal ideation, be it loneliness? What is the biggest psychological risk of someone spending months of the time away from family, away from Earth? And what would the cost be if they sabotage the mission? Is there anyone in your network of friends who is suicidal? And what is the most potent response that you could bring to the table to reduce the odds that they would commit suicide unfortunately? Meaning occasionally there may be a good reason to decrease a very painful end-of-life situation. But what would you do? What would you say to reduce the odds of an unfortunate, of a poorly thought out suicide? And where do you get that evidence from? What is your partner's love language? What is your love language? And does your partner know it? On a 1 to 10 scale, what is the level of your emotional well-being? And what would be the best path to improve, right? To spend the least amount of energy to improve your emotional well-being, your emotional outlook on life. What are the 10 most optimal futures that lie ahead of you amongst all of the many horrible, okay, good, and amazing futures? What are the 10 futures that are most optimal? Meaning they're doable. They don't take an enormous amount of suffering to realize them. And they would bring about your sense of joy, your sense of fulfillment, were you to create them. Do you know what it means to be an adult? Are you an adult? And how do you know whether or not you are an adult? Not a grown-up, not a specific chronological age, but how do you know whether or not you are an adult? What skills, were you or your children to learn them, would have the highest likelihood of bringing well-being not only to you, not only to them, but to the species? What skills would be most useful for you or your children to learn to humanity over the next 100 years? Do you know how many trees you would need to plant in order to be carbon neutral, right? As someone existing in a given lifestyle, there have been trees cut down for your toilet paper, for your stationery, for your buildings, trees cleared to make roads, right? Then there's carbon being generated through gasoline and campfires and all of those things. How many trees would you need to plant for you to be carbon neutral over your lifetime? And how many trees of those have you planted? And what would it cost to pay someone to plant that number of trees? Do you know your value hierarchy and the value hierarchy of the closest people around you? And what I mean is, everyone wants honesty, wants to be able to trust, and everyone wants to have a good time. But some people value having a good time more than being trustworthy, and some people value being trustworthy more than having a good time, right? In other words, everyone values the same values, but everyone places a different emphasis, a different priority sequence in each of their values. Do you know what your value priority sequence or value hierarchy is? And do you know how it correlates or is different from the value hierarchy of the people around you? How many hours in the course of your lifetime have you received competent parental literacy, competent parental training based on science? Meaning they've done a study of this type of parenting, and a study of this type of parenting, and a study of this type of parenting. And based on the data of a large cross-section of parents, it has been determined that this type of parenting leads to a better outcome than this type of parenting. And you've familiarized yourself with that data as a guide to being a more competent parent based on science. Do you know the definition of the word trauma? Do you know the definition of the word or the words post-traumatic stress disorder? Do you know the path that trauma must take in order to transmute into PTSD? And do you know how to arrest that path? How to effectively interrupt the path as trauma is going from a temporary phenomena that can be resolved over the next month to an undefined long-term condition that may not be resolved before death, right? Do you know how to interrupt trauma on its journey to becoming PTSD? And do you have multiple protocols for doing so? How many people in your family have PTSD or complex PTSD? How many people in your family know the answer to that question? what is the financial cost of having undiagnosed complex PTSD in the Western world over the course of a decade, over the course of a lifetime? If you compare 1,000 people who are homeless and 1,000 people who are housed, do you know how many years of human life are reduced as a result of being chronically homeless? Do you know the most common cause of homelessness? Do you know the cost in property values, in untreated diseases that become resilient to antibiotics, right? Because people who are homeless may start taking a course of antibiotics, but with the difficulty of moving around, with the difficulty of sleeping, with trauma, with addictions, they may not finish the course of antibiotics. And so as antibiotic-resistant strains of disease take hold and are transmitted in a low immune system environment, low cleanliness, low immune system, as those diseases take hold, do you know the full cost of a country treating those antibiotic-resistant diseases? Do you know the impact on the empathic brain, the human brain, a human being, of driving by a group of homeless people day after day after day and noticing that tens of thousands of people who are aware of these individuals without basic shelter are not responding in any way that provides or enables these people to secure safe legal housing in any form? What is the impact on the empathic or human brain witnessing tens of thousands of people behaving sociopathically? What percentage of your population is depressed, and what are the most effective paths to resolve or be less depressed? Do you understand the basis for people with luxurious outer environments to want to die, to be in more pain psychologically, mentally, physiologically than well-being, despite luxurious environment, having more luxuries than kings just 500 years ago? Do you understand why a growing percentage of people think about death, about dying? There are a lot of technologies and movements towards a better world. There are a lot of patterns and movements and momentums towards a worse world. Do you know what things are getting better in your community and what things are getting worse, and by what degree? Right? If 1% of your community is homeless, and last year or 10 years ago it was 0.5 or it was 0.5%, and now it's 1%. Do you know the rate at which homelessness is increasing or decreasing in your community? And do you know the cost that your community is spending to resolve homelessness for one person? Do you know the hospital bills paid by the taxpayer of managing a chronically homeless person without health insurance? Do you know how much the taxpayer pays per person just for that one line item? If someone wanted to love you completely, utterly, passionately love you in a way that would be ideal, how would they go about doing that? Does anyone know how to go about doing that? Have you told anyone? Has anyone asked? If you could create a peak experience once a month, an optimal peak experience with someone new or someone in your life, if you could do that and you wanted to do that, do you know how to go about it so that every month or 4 times a year you have a reliable peak experience that is 10 to 100 times more satisfying than your average experience? Have you ever had a transcendent experience sexually, where in orgasm and in lovemaking you've entered an altered state with a partner and had a sense of unity with all things, a sense of transcendent love for self and others? Have you ever had a transcendent experience with psychedelic plant compounds, DMT, psilocybin, mushrooms, marijuana, peyote, San Pedro, ayahuasca? Have you ever had a transcendent experience with psychedelics that you were able to have in a safe environment, learn something about yourself, and bring that back into your world? If not, do you know where to go to have such an experience that has a 90 to 99% probability of being a profound and meaningful event in your life? If you wanted to save someone's life, let's say you want to make a difference, you want to have a meaningful impact, and you want to save someone's life this year, do you know the most cost-effective way to do that statistically, and how many dollars you would have to spend? In other words, if you wanted to save someone's life in the most efficient way possible, spending the least amount of time, the least amount of money, the least amount of natural resources, that would save someone's life, do you know how to do that? And do you know which nonprofit would save more lives per dollar than any other nonprofit in the world? If you want to plant a tree, do you know where to donate or send the money to plant more trees per dollar than any other place in the world? with trees that have the highest likelihood of germinating and being long-term contributors to ameliorating global warming, or at least cleaner air. Do you know which chemicals in your house, in your diet, in your shampoo, do you know which chemicals have the most adverse impact on both the quality and length of your life? And have you seen studies that make that clear to you? If you are an addictive personality, you need to do certain things compulsively. Do you know which activities, if done compulsively, and which substances, if consumed compulsively, will do the least amount of long-term damage and give you what you need to survive in that compulsive state? Have you analyzed how you could be both compulsive and move forward rather than being compulsive and destroying your life? For example, compulsively working and getting better at your job versus compulsively taking heroin. Now, we can go on for another hour asking questions that statistically no one has ever asked you, and statistically you don't know the answer to, and statistically neither does anyone else. Now, the theme here is that no one is asking the important questions, and no one is volunteering the most important answers necessary to collaborate to create a 10x increase in quality of life per dollar, per hour, per unit of natural resources. Intelligence can be measured by the efficiency with which time, money, and natural resources is transformed into sustainable human well-being. And to increase our intelligence, we need better data. And in a don't ask, don't tell culture, I don't have the data I need, and you don't have the data you need to respond, to make better choices. But what if that were to change? What if a confidential app gathering metadata run by a nonprofit for the sole purpose of giving people an opportunity to answer the most important questions that no one's ever asked, and to develop good answers that we can learn from together, to track the important metrics in our own and other people's well-being, as well as to master and learn and share the best practices that will improve well-being in all of these areas. Now, I think it's incredible that no one in my entire life has asked 99% of those questions. And I find it equally incredible that the people I have asked these questions of generally say that nobody has ever asked them, and sometimes they've never even thought of the answer. Well, when we know the speed of light but don't know the love language of our own partner, when we know the chemical compound of copper but do not know how to stop trauma becoming PTSD in our own children, we can see the failure of our education, of our culture, to prioritize the most relevant information. And that's where happiness data comes in, to develop an app that collects and shares metadata for the sole purpose of increasing the scientific basis for better decisions of anyone that wants to use the app. Right? That has as its sole purpose gathering data about the impact of the app and iterating until we have a user interface and experience that generates more well-being through more informed and better choices than any other decision-making protocol in the history of the species. That just gets better and better and is evaluated on one metric. How many minutes do people spend on the app? And how much does their life improve? Physically, emotionally, socially, mentally, sexually, financially, ecologically, logistically? How much better is their life per minute of use of the app? Right? And that what is highlighted, what is amplified, are best practices by people getting enormous returns on their time, on their money, on the natural resources they consume in terms of sustainable well-being. Right? This could be the single most valuable trove of information in the history of the species. And you know how valuable it is if you consider what would happen if you knew the answer to all those questions, and so did the people around you. And the gap from there to where we're going can be measured by how many people in your life do know the answers to those questions, right? Because an informed population, rather than an ignorant population, can easily 10x its well-being. Thank you for your attention.